In the very oversaturated genre of indie game horror, there are a lot of hits and a larger amount of misses. A lot of games aren't exactly well executed, don't have the best story, or the game just straight up isn't good. In the world of indie game horror, small things such as game mechanics, premise, and everything in between are literally the difference between your game being a Markiplier video or being in his 3 Scary Games compilations. Even horror games that do make an impression on the internet have another challenge in store: staying relevant. And that challenge is hard. Developers usually get hung up on game updates or sequels and don't really know what's the best way to live up to the product they made since they have so many eyes on them. It's hard, downright demotivating, and due to some developers' visions, impossible. But not for Scott Cawthon.
Relax and take notes while I take totes of the marijuana smoke. Throw you in the choke, gun smoke.
Five Nights at Freddy's is a series that needs no introduction. Everyone knows what FNAF is, and even if they didn't, they eventually found out because it has the ability to come back from the dead through memes. Michael Let Me Out, The Man Behind the Slaughter, Connection Terminated, and... oh. But let's take it back.
What we do here is go back.
FNAF 1 was a massive hit and might be single-handedly responsible for putting indie horror on the map. It was the necessary clean glass of filtered ice-cold water for the dry indie game horror scene. It was revolutionary, having such a unique premise of being stuck at a Chuck E. Cheese being hunted by creepy animatronics. You literally cannot think of anything else when you hear that premise. It's iconic. There's no amount of praise I could give it that wasn't given by the army of people who enjoyed it. All eyes were on FNAF, and how was Scott Cawthon going to respond to this? After all, this was going to be his last game. He's never had one of his games pop off as much as FNAF 1 did. Well, he responded the best way he could. He dropped the best game in the entire franchise. I think FNAF 2 is a perfect sequel. If you look up or just ask around what everyone's favorite FNAF game is, most likely you get the answer, FNAF 2, or Security Breach because it's the newest one. But if you ask people what the best classic FNAF experience is, they'd say FNAF 2. This is for good reason. It just was simply peak FNAF. W gameplay, W atmosphere, and W lore. The lore in this game is when the story was at its best. No glitch traps or robot children, just a simple expansion and deeper dive into what the first game set up. FNAF 2 could have honestly ended the story there because over the course of the game it told a beginning, middle, and wrapped up with an end. But it didn't, and if it did, FNAF wouldn't be as successful as it is now, and I'm glad to see Scott Cawthon eating. But FNAF 2 did what a lot of sequels failed to do with 10 times the budget Scott had, and it all started with the trailer.
What the hell is that?
Not only did Scott Cawthon release the best FNAF game, he made the best trailer in the franchise. It built off the hype of the first game and created the perfect teaser for what was to come. Why was our classic animatronics destroyed and replaced by toy-like counterparts? Why were there no doors? And how are we even supposed to defend ourselves? Do we get stuffed when we lose? It showed off just the perfect amount of context clues while still leaving much of the game unknown for players to experience. Large lore implications and lots of theory bait. I should probably by this point explain my criteria and what I think are the elements that make a perfect sequel. I feel a sequel needs to not forget what made the predecessor so great and honor the original while still offering something new. The sequel should change up the formula and or improve some aspects of the predecessor. And at the very least, I feel a sequel should offer something story-wise that makes it mean something in the greater scheme of the franchise. FNAF 2 has checked all those boxes. FNAF 2 honored the original by including the cast from the first game while adding an interesting new cast of characters. The gameplay is different but still follows that stressful time management game that the first game set up and cranks it up to a 10. It isn't a big difference in terms of the original concept, and instead of introducing something drastically different, it decides to explore the content spread out from its roots and change up the experience while still being familiar. It's an interesting premise to see the original cast weathered and essentially replaced. It makes you wonder what exactly happened to them after the events of the first game and how they will work in this new establishment. Is the Fazbear company rebranding due to the missing children cases? How is the phone guy still alive? And why did Chica go from being thick to thick? Well, most of that was answered through the game's clever way of subtle and unique storytelling, but more on that later. The atmosphere felt more vibrant, obviously due to the more brighter color palette. FNAF 1 was dark and it was hard to really imagine the layout of this family diner despite clearly seeing the layout. FNAF 2 was more believable as a kid's restaurant in my opinion. I could somewhat imagine myself being there. It's more immersive mainly because it fits the aesthetic. FNAF 2 felt grand while FNAF 1 felt low budget, which is something that was intended. The larger space to work with was beneficial because the rooms were way more interesting in my opinion. The parts in the service room alone is a great set piece that kind of foreshadows the threats to come. Imagine the unimaginable terror you'd feel if you were a security guard and noticed the previously dead animatronics were not in there anymore. That would legit be terrifying. It was necessary for FNAF 2 to change up the conventional gameplay so it wouldn't just be a copy and paste from the first. But when doing stuff like that, and this doesn't just apply to FNAF, you have to find that sweet spot that merges the old with the new. Introduce something fresh while still, like the previous segment, honoring the original. Bad examples of this would be Alien Isolation, Alien Blackout, Origami 1 or Origami 2, gonna make a whole video about that, or the generally accepted notion, FNAF 2 to FNAF 3. FNAF 2 managed to introduce a lot of new things that blended perfectly with what the series was known for at that point in time. For example, the new animatronics and the redesign of the old ones. Scott could have done the bare minimum and just copied and pasted the original cast and maybe just changed up the location, but he didn't. He created probably the most interesting, iconic versions of the cast. No one would have thought we would see the main cast destroyed and put in a state like that, and it had a lot of lore implications before even the game was released. The withered animatronics were literally symbolic of out with the old and in with the new, and the new was the toy animatronics. The toy animatronics are admittedly not really memorable, to a degree. Besides Toy Chica and Mangle. Toy Chica because she has the interesting property to take off her beak when she's on the prowl, a distinct characteristic no one else had. And Mangle because he was a very interesting amalgamation of an animatronic. The idea that children literally ripped her apart and the staff just left them like that because they know it would just happen again is genuinely an interesting piece of character. I genuinely enjoy the little things about the characters and things and stories that stand out. I don't count the puppet as a toy animatronic, but the idea of her needing music so she wouldn't just straight up kill you says a lot. Then there's him. There's a lot of variety in the cast, not for the sake of being different, but for serving a purpose. The withered animatronics are there because they were scrapped for parts and forgotten, or because the purple guy destroyed them. I'm not clear on that one actually. The toy animatronics are there to replace the withered animatronics, and the puppet is there to give gifts, give life. Mainly a lore element, but nonetheless an interesting addition. Some people argue FNAF 3 isn't the most important because it introduced the spring trap, but FNAF 2 introduced the man behind the slaughter himself, as well as the sleuth of crying children people to this day still can't agree the true identity of. The cast is great, iconic, but without the new game mechanics got introduced, the cast would probably mean nothing. Scott had the bold idea to introduce new game mechanics that essentially replaced how the game was played entirely. I'm talking about Zero Doors. Such a crazy concept to fathom back then, mainly because the FNAF franchise was only known for one style of unique gameplay. But nonetheless, Scott managed to pull it off while introducing something slightly more complex to replace the look at cameras, turn on the door light, and close the door type of gameplay. The Freddy mask is such a cool yet clever way of defending yourself. The whole reason they want to kill you is because you don't look like them. And giving a mask to fix that is both cool and clever. It's still kind of a clutch just like doors, but it isn't the only way to protect yourself. In FNAF 2, Scott started this thing in his gameplay where almost all of his mechanics had catches. You could use the mask to hide from animatronics, but you won't be able to use the cameras, and some animatronics aren't fooled by it. You could use the flashlights to stun animatronics and get them off of you, but it has a battery. You could stalk the cameras, but the number one reason to check the cameras in the first place is to wind the music box. I feel like this is such an improvement over flashlight closed door because that's literally all you had to do in FNAF 1. The door stopped every animatronic as opposed to the Freddy mask only stopping a majority, and a select few would be immune, forcing you to use everything at your disposal. There are no safe havens in this game. You can't close the door and be in an unreachable office. Everything is open. You are the main attraction. Even the vents are open. When you put on the mask, it isn't a type of immunity compared to locking a Bonnie or Chica outside your door. The animatronics get up in your face, leaving literally no space to breathe. And as soon as they go away, you can't collect your thoughts because you remembered you gotta check the music box. Lots of more things to manage since not every animatronic is dealt with the same way. When you get to the higher nights, it ends up being a memory game. Check the hallway, check the vents, mask, and wind the music box. Now I know that may sound bad when I simplify it like that, but it's a certain type of when you chose gameplay that's fun. It may get repetitive and the only challenge ends up being RNG, but the mechanics are there to combat the RNG. Like I stated, there is now more than one way to protect yourself. Don't have to rely on the door where the animatronics can literally just camp you for an indefinite amount of time. The characters do have different paths and some of them have multiple. Alongside complementing this is the audio, the most iconic in the entire franchise, because honestly, do I need to say more? To put it simply, FNAF 2's audio is really, really good. It's such an odd mix of sounds that somehow work. Like, literally the most iconic one sounds like submarine ambience, but I can't imagine it being a better fit. The sound design is good, and if you want a deep dive, I'd recommend this video by Scruffy or Saken Hawk's whole section on audio in his FNAF retrospective. In this game, audio is utilized very well. Mangle has a jump up voice box, the laugh balloon mocks you when you get into your room, the music box when it runs out, and the jump scare. FNAF 2 jump scare is probably the most iconic. All these audio elements together wrap up this experience in a neat little bow. It acts as an essential part of the pie that FNAF 2 could not simply exist without. Little things for FNAF 1 like Freddy's laugh and hearing Chica stumble around in the kitchen are amplified in this game. The amount of dread the music box alarm is downright terrifying, especially if you don't know what's going to happen next. Everything down to the sounds that the animatronics make in front of your mask to the mask itself is great, and like I said many times before, iconic. But there's one more thing that's iconic about FNAF 2 that really set the stage where the franchise was going to go for the next installments. FNAF 1 exists to plant the seeds of the storyline by its use of background pieces of lore hidden in plain sight, but I do see FNAF 2 as the true genesis of the storyline. In FNAF 2, we got the start of perhaps the most oddly complex and frustrating pieces of fiction indie games have seen in the past decade. This creepy twist on child mascots really started to take a turn into an odd yet, at the time, unique and interesting story. The saga of the purple guy and the mystery of the missing children. I'm no FNAF expert, so don't expect from me to get into the nitty details on how exactly the story expanded into robot children and serial killer viruses. I'm more rather gonna go into why it's good and the attributes to it being at the very least a perfect sequel in the terms of the franchise. FNAF 2 could have simply left the story out entirely. Animatronics already fall into that uncanny valley of creepy, so you don't need an explanation why they're doing scary stuff, but Scott really doubled down and expanded a storyline that was, dare I say, good. I've thrown around the word unique when talking about FNAF because FNAF was unique. It wouldn't have blown up if it wasn't, and to accompany just how unique the game was, the storyline was unique too. We all know the story. 5 missing children, or more, before everything got out of whack, and one surrounding mystery behind it. That's what FNAF 1 set up, and it also sprinkled in other mysteries like the Bite of 87 and Golden Freddy. FNAF 2 simply took that and expanded it. It did that in a special way, making the lore interactive, the death minigames, and the pre-night cutscenes. They walked so Midnight Motorists could drive. FNAF 2 was the starting point for how Scott was going to carry out the lore for the greater part of the franchise. Let's talk about the lore on the surface. If you're an elite gamer and made it through the nights without encountering the death minigames, the story on the surface was similar to the first. You're a sleazy security guard who works like the deadliest Chuck E. Cheese on the planet. It's false repetition. Despite the circumstances being the same, the way you're supposed to deal with them are fundamentally different. There's a new cast of animatronics and Freddy and the gang are destroyed and left out for display. But knowing the nature of these animatronics due to the exposure of the first game, you know Freddy and friends aren't going to be offline for long. From just the first 20 seconds of the game, you can gather a lot of what's to come from just pure visuals alone, all accompanied by a phone guy who's explaining the job as if it were just some normal 9 to 5. He provides the right amount of exposition while still obeying the show don't tell. If anything, he foreshadows the events to come and gives you updates on the story of the outside world beyond your shift and provides an ongoing narrative that marches towards the end.
They've spent a small fortune on these new animatronics. Facial recognition, advanced mobility, they even let them walk around during the day. Oh hey, before I go, I wanted to ease your mind about any rumors you might have heard lately. People trying to make a buck, you know. Our guard during the day has reported nothing unusual. Okay, so just to update you, there's been somewhat of an investigation going on. We may end up having to close for a few days, I don't know. But try to avoid eye contact with any of the animatronics side if you can. Someone may have tampered with their facial recognition systems. We're not sure. From what I understand, the building is on lockdown. No one is allowed in or out, especially concerning any previous employees. When we get it all sorted out, we may move you to the day shift. A position just became available. Hello. What on earth are you doing there? Didn't you get the memo? The place is closed down, at least for a while. Someone used one of the suits. We had a spare in the back, a yellow one. Someone used it. Now none of them are acting right.
The ending is admittedly nothing to run to the Oscars for, especially considering the later entries in the franchise, but the ending of this game is still something notable. After you tread through the 5 nights of hell and receive that minimum wage, you get the clarity of knowing the horror is over. No more 5 Nights at Freddy's. Wait. For many, it's an oversight. But for the attentive and the lore enthusiasts, it's a bombshell. The entirety of FNAF 2 is a prequel, so I guess it can't be the perfect sequel. It's so cleverly shown that it actually was easy to not see back then. But it was in our face the whole time. It makes sense because instead of the outside lore focusing on the now, it seems to focus on the later. All the minigames focus on the FNAF 1 characters instead of FNAF 2. Even the pre-night cutscenes clearly take place in FNAF 1, which implies a lie and sets up a timeline. I'm gonna go out on a whim here and say FNAF 2 is the era of the Bite of 87. The missing children cases happened in the era of FNAF 1, and due to what the phone guy says, there was a previous era even before both games. Through minimal storytelling, Scott has achieved a good amount of world building and definitely expanded the scope of the story. From there, things sort of make sense. Freddy and gang look different in each game because in FNAF 2, they were from another pizza establishment. After events of the game, they were refurbished into the FNAF 1 designs. Everything in FNAF 1 is archaic compared to FNAF 2 because FNAF 1 is lower budget due to the Bite of 87. Phone Guy is alive because FNAF 2 is a prequel to FNAF 1. The reason why anyone would program an animatronic to run is because of its quirky entertainment routine. Now, here's what it doesn't answer: the greater meaning of it all. Who is this mysterious killer? How does the puppet contain the power to give gifts, give life? What is the puppet and what is Golden Freddy? Scott is a stubborn user of show don't tell. Most of that stuff is vaguely answered by even vaguer details that really only leaves more questions than answers. What the story seemingly sheds lights on, it leaves a lot of stuff in the dark. It's all in the approach that it's told. It's never really spelled out for you, it's the idea of it. The pre-night cutscenes are a good example of Scott's unusual way of storytelling. Stuck inside of what seems to be a Freddy Fazbear suit, but every night you get this unnerving development that you really shouldn't be there. First, Bonnie and Chica have a stare-off with you, then what I assume is Golden Freddy, and then the puppet. Even though these are credited as streams in the files, it's still probably one of the most unnerving parts of the franchise, of course complemented with the weird yet perfect choice of sound design. Death minigames expand the missing children mystery. In each of the minigames, we see a documented case of the murder of the missing children, albeit some most likely don't pan out as they are shown, but again, it's the idea of it. We learn the driving force in the animatronic sentience via the puppet and experience the darker mystery of the purple guy. But we don't get to know about the purple guy till FNAF 3, so I'll take that as an opportunity to end that here. I think FNAF 2 is the best example of what the FNAF franchise was built upon, and in terms of the series, I do think it's a perfect sequel. It honors the original, introduces something new, changes up the formula, and expands the story. And, yeah, bye.
Relax and take notes while I take totes of the marijuana smoke.